Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, this is Haryan Gláeddyv coming at you from a nationwide house arrest. For those of you not quite caught up, here is our lovely Prime Minister Boris Johnson explaining it for you.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will make a statement on our response to the rising number of coronavirus cases and how we must act now to avoid still graver consequences later on.
A quick reminder to those of you that didn't manage to catch my last video on this, it is true that cases are rising. However, as I also went through in the last video, the death rate appears to not be rising at all, and there is also one for hospitalisations, which is also remaining rather low and doesn't appear to be rising in correlation with the cases. So the conclusion I came to last video, when it wasn't quite lockdown 2, but it was definitely we need more restrictions on your liberties, people of Britain, I concluded that further restrictions would not actually help in terms of stopping people from dying, but at the same time it would absolutely negatively affect the economy, which has taken quite a downturn recently. But let's see what Bojo has to say.
At every stage in this pandemic, we have struck a delicate balance between saving lives by protecting our NHS and minimising the wider impact of our restrictions. And it's because of the common sense fortitude of the British people that earlier this year we were able to avert an even worse catastrophe, forming a human shield around our NHS and then getting our country moving again by reopening key sectors of our economy, returning children to school.
I mean, yes, he's referring to the we need to flatten the curve, which at this point appears to have happened when it comes to, well, cases, deaths and hospitalisations. However, now we're not really getting a second curve for deaths and hospitalisations, we're only getting it for cases, which have a tendency to come up with false positives, given that people may have had the virus may have died, but it still comes up as positive in the test. But what exactly is causing the fact that we are having a massive rise in cases, but a low death and hospitalisation rate, I'm not entirely sure what the proportion of just having asymptomatic COVID is compared to how many false positives there are. And I can't find good sources to say that asymptomatic carriers will necessarily carry on the strain that may be symptomatic and cause more hospitalisations and death. However, I think we can find from these correlations of more cases, less deaths, less hospitalisations, we are probably at a point where we can go for a herd immunity, since asymptomatic COVID seems to be the main driving force behind it. But honestly, I'd let the scientists work that out personally. Don't just go off my personal opinion from this. But of course, we'll get into what the scientists say later.
But we always knew that while we might have driven the virus into retreat, the prospect of a second wave was real. And I'm sorry to say that, as in Spain and France and many other countries, we've reached a perilous turning point.
Well, alright, we're comparing it to Spain and France. Let's have a quick look at Spain and France's curves. So as we can see, this is a comparison between the UK, France and Spain's death counts due to COVID-19. And as you can see, the first wave, it's all pretty similar. You get a big wave up throughout April, and it starts to peter out and fall down by around June time. And then, as you can see, from about September, Spain at least starts rising again, France rises a bit, and Britain stays low. But it looks nothing like the first wave that we got of it. Now, this could be due to better lockdown practices now in each country. However, as was pointed out by the fact that cases are high but hospitalisation and deaths are low, we're probably getting less lethal versions of COVID-19, because viruses have this tendency to mutate very quickly. And ones that kill people are obviously going to be better at infecting people, because generally of the way we deal with COVID-related deaths. We then move on to this graph with the hospitalisation curves. This just shows that Spain doesn't count the hospitalisations, probably because there were a lot of them. But we can imagine that the curve was about the same for Spain with the France and the UK, because the deaths were similar and they all seem to be correlated. But as you can see here, the curve is going up quite a bit in the August area, quite a bit more than the deaths. So once again, there seems to be less lethality, but there definitely seems to be some sort of symptomatic virus still about. But at the moment, it doesn't look like the type of thing we should be panicking over. And here now you see we have a daily France COVID-19 cases, hospitalizations and deaths with a 7-day rolling average. You can see the cases have just skyrocketed. I presume that's because we've all got a lot better at testing. But as you can see, there doesn't seem to be a bigger correlation as there was with the first wave when it comes to hospitalizations and deaths. I mean, as you saw from the last two graphs, it rises slightly with hospitalizations, but deaths just seems to have flatlined compared to it. So again, it seems to be showing we have less lethal strains of the virus going about, but either there's a lot of asymptomatic people or we're getting a lot of false positives. Probably a mixture, but again, I don't know the proportions. And finally, just to hammer it home, as you can see, we are seeing pretty much the exact same pattern in Spain. And given how close all the comparative graphs actually overlie each other, we're probably going to see a similar thing in Britain. And I personally don't think that having a second lockdown is the answer to this. I do honestly think herd immunity is the way to go now. Because as can be heard in any Laughing at the Guardian episode with Dr. Allegedly, his plan for COVID-19 would have been lockdown pretty hard for 2 weeks to a month, something like that. And then from there, you've probably saved as many people as you can from hospitalization and death. And then you'll probably be all right to slowly weaken the lockdown and let herd immunity take over. And at this point, we've been in lockdown for way longer than that. And as we can see, deaths seem to have just flatlined. Hospitalizations seem to have not be rising as much. And to be honest, a lot of COVID beds, even in the area I'm in, which is pretty badly affected by it, they're empty. Literally placed in the NHS, reserved for people that need them, aren't using them up. And it seems to be because the symptoms aren't as bad as we saw when the virus originally came out. But anyway, that's just quickly going over the graphs that I managed to find. We shall get back to Bojo.
A month ago, on average, around 1,000 people across the UK were testing positive for coronavirus every day. The latest figure has almost quadrupled to 3,929.
Likely because testing has got a lot better and it's been more encouraged, and people showing any sign of symptoms are heavily encouraged to go get tested, which is good, fine, and I don't have many problems with that.
Yesterday, the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor warned that the doubling rate for new cases could be between 7 and 20 days, with the possibility of tens of thousands of new infections next month.
Positive cases, he should really say there, because a positive case is not necessarily an infection. And again, if we're at a point where it's not causing hospitalizations or death, really my question would be, what is the point? We are ruining the economy for this, for what appears to be a save just one life type of fallacious argument. But the problem with that argument is that you can use that to ban any sort of transport, because everyone takes risk in life. And yes, the COVID risk does affect the older generation more, but again, I still think it should be up to them whether they want to take a risk and go outside or stay indoors and hide from the virus. I know elderly people with the more freedom opinion and more with the I want to stay inside and hide opinion, and it's entirely up to them what they do, and that's how I think the government should be running now. But unfortunately, we're going to hear from Boris exactly why that's not the case.
I wish I could reassure the House that the growing number of cases is merely a function of more testing, but a rising proportion of the tests themselves are yielding a positive result. I also wish I could say that more of our people now have the antibodies to keep the virus off, but the latest data suggests that fewer than 8% of us are in this position.
Fair enough, and what's the best way to get antibodies? Catch the infection. And again, as it seems that deaths have flatlined and hospitalizations aren't rising that much at all, I think now should be the time where we open it up. We seem to have flattened the curve. We are now changing tactics here and saying that flattening the curve isn't enough. We need to get the number of cases right down.
It's true that the number of new cases is growing fastest amongst those aged 20 to 29, but the evidence shows that the virus is spreading to other, more vulnerable age groups, as we have seen in France and Spain, where this has led to increased hospital admissions and, sadly, more deaths.
Yes, and we've went through before the graphs in detail, and yes, that is true, there are more hospitalizations and deaths, but it is not at all comparable to the curves we saw before.
In the last fortnight, daily hospital admissions in England have more than doubled.
To about 240.
Tens of thousands of daily infections in October would, as night follows day, lead to hundreds of daily deaths in November, and those numbers would continue to grow unless we act.
That doesn't appear to be what's happening in Spain, though. You say you are basing this off Spain and France, who, by all accounts, seem to be about a month or so ahead of us. From the looks of this, it looks like hospitalizations are going up to about 500 and deaths have gone up to about, I don't know, we can barely tell from that graph, but, you know, maybe in the 100s, maybe 200s. And don't get me wrong, I would like to avoid death as much as possible, but that's exactly why I want the economy going again, so we don't end up in massive debt, having to pay it off, and basically starving to death because the country can't afford anything.
And as with all respiratory viruses, COVID is likely to spread faster as autumn becomes winter.
That is true, to be fair. The reason cold and flu season is generally in winter isn't because it's actually colder. It's usually because a lot of people stay indoors, huddle up together to keep warm. Yeah, someone has a cold, the whole household gets it. Or, you know, if you're at a party indoors, the whole party gets it.
Yesterday, on the advice of the 4 chief medical officers, the UK's COVID alert level was raised from 3 to 4, the second most serious stage, meaning that transmission is high or rising exponentially.
Which by all accounts does seem to be true, but I mean this was to be expected from the first lockdown. You stop the infection spreading because we need to work out how to deal with these hospitalizations and deaths. So when we come out of lockdown and more people are getting infected, if there's less hospitalizations and deaths anyway, what is the need to lock down? Let's try and get that 8% immunity right up to 80%. And I'm not entirely sure how the COVID alert system works, why it's gone from 3 to 4, but I can imagine with the R number going above 1, meaning it's exponentially rising, then fair enough, that is probably true. Now, does this mean we should necessarily act on it? Well, I say listen to the scientists. Apart from that one who used a model that clearly doesn't work, his name escapes me, and he should be forgotten with time.
So, this is the moment when we must act. If we can curb the number of daily infections and reduce the reproduction rate to 1, then we can save lives, protect the NHS and the most vulnerable, and shelter the economy from the far sterner and more costly measures that would inevitably become necessary later on.
Yeah, but the problem here is that, okay, you say you're protecting the economy by saving costs later on. The problem is that you are making costs right now by locking down again. I mean, we lost a fifth of our GDP over the course of the lockdown, and as it was releasing, it went up again. I mean, just look at the ONS's chart for the GDP. I mean, yeah, in 2008, we get the 2008 crash, and then we go up to COVID, and it goes below where we were after the 2008 crash, and we're just about reaching the point again where we were at the trough of the 2008 crash. So yeah, sure, we might save money later on by not having to spend the measures we need later on if deaths and hospitalizations do go up, which from the looks of it won't happen anyway. But I think we can guarantee that this will absolutely not recover, and in fact you may even see a second crash. But no, Boris, do tell me exactly why the economy will be better off.
The government will introduce new restrictions in England, carefully judged to achieve the maximum reduction in the R number with the minimum damage to lives and livelihoods.
The radical centrist position, I see. Let's see how it goes.
I want to stress that this is by no means a return to the full lockdown of March. We're not issuing a general instruction to stay at home. We will ensure that schools, colleges and universities stay open because nothing is more important than the education, health and well-being of our young people. We will ensure that businesses can stay open in a COVID-compliant way. However, we must take action to suppress the disease.
So at the very least, it's not a full-on stay-at-home lockdown. So at least it doesn't appear to be house arrest again, though. At the moment, the rule of 6 is still going on. You are only allowed to be in a group of 6 at any one point anywhere. Otherwise, you will get fined. And although he says place of education will still stay open, people that I know at uni are just entirely doing their courses online. Though I am aware that school buses are at least running in my area, so it appears that schools are open, but they are quite dystopian in the way that they organise their classrooms. Splitting off desks, having screens between each pupil, it looks awful, and I'd hate it as a learning environment, but there we go.
First, we are once again asking office workers who can work from home to do so.
Well, at least that means you still get videos from me in the week.
In key public services and in all professions where home working is not possible, such as construction or retail, people should continue to attend their workplaces. And like government, this House will be free to take forward its business in a COVID-secure way, which you, Mr. Speaker, have pioneered.
So key workers, etc., are still doing what they were doing before, right? That's all okay.
Second, from Thursday, all pubs, bars and restaurants must operate a table service only, Mr. Speaker, except for takeaways.
That's pretty much what every single pub I've been to has worked like, so okay, that doesn't seem to have changed much either.
Together with all hospitality venues, they must close at 10 p.m.
Yep, this was the biggie. This was the one that made Facebook be absolutely full of memes like the ones you see on screen. Now, in fairness to the government here, I think their plan of attack on the virus here is because sunlight seems to be a good disinfectant for the virus. I think there is evidence that it's not as infectious during daytime hours, so they want pubs to not be full at more nighttime hours, though when it comes to winter, that's usually about 5 p.m. in England. And the other problem, of course, is that if pubs and public places aren't open at 10 p.m, people will literally just go back to their own houses with the group of 6 they had anyway. So I don't really see the point for this, apart from maybe at least the groups of 6 are less likely to interact. Though again, I can't see this helping the economy, because I'm pretty sure that most pubs make most of their money after 10 p.m, when people just keep getting the rounds in. So yeah, the government's plan has gone from eat out to help out to drink up and fuck off.
And to help the police enforce this rule, I'm afraid that means, alas, closing and not just calling for last orders, because simplicity is paramount. The same will apply to takeaways, though deliveries can continue thereafter. And I'm sorry that this will affect many businesses just getting back on their feet, but we must act to stop the virus from being transmitted in bars and restaurants.
And again, no, I do not agree. I'm very much on the government's first plan for the virus, which was to enact herd immunity, because we're only at 8% apparently. We could really do with that rising quite a lot. Works for many other diseases and viruses. I don't see why it wouldn't work for COVID. But also, it's worth pointing out that scientists themselves don't think this will work. Coronavirus pub curfew at 10 p.m. won't be effective, science advisors fear. Early closing for pubs and restaurants was not recommended by scientific advisors and was adopted by Number 10 in an imitation of Belgium in response to evidence that drunk people were spreading the virus. Scientists advising the government have warned that this measure is unlikely to be enough, while the industry said it would devastate hospitality, threaten thousands of jobs, and could backfire, i.e. everything I have been saying so far. So the article goes into quite a few people from the hospitality industry complaining about this new 10 p.m. curfew, which is fine. I completely understand their problems with this. But then we get into the important stuff, which is the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, that did not model the effect of a 10 p.m. curfew, with key members saying there was no evidence that it would be effective, despite what Boris Johnson said. Nor was the behavioural science subgroup consulted about how people would react to early closing. Professor Robert West of University College London, a member of the group, said, "Closing early will have some impact, but I don't think it will be anything like enough, even with the other measures announced, to stop the increase." And that is, of course, assuming stopping the increase is your goal, which I understand again for hospitalisation and death, but for cases I am a bit more sceptical. So basically it seems that Boris Johnson is just lying through his teeth when it comes to him saying he's following the science. He's not. He seems to be trying to follow other countries' lead, which if you ask me isn't necessarily a good idea, especially since he's trying to follow what Spain and France's curves look like. Why he'd then move on to what Belgium are doing, I do not know. But anyway, let's get back to what he says.
Third, we will extend the requirement to wear face coverings to include staff in retail, all users of taxis and private hire vehicles, and staff and customers in indoor hospitality, except when seated at a table to eat or drink.
Okay, so now we all have to be muzzled more, despite the fact, again, that there is evidence that wearing the mask alone isn't that helpful. It is good for stopping aerosols and not that much more, which, to be fair, COVID-19 is. However, when it comes to other people cooking your food for you, you are obviously touching food with your hands, putting it to your mouth, things like that. Which is why in hospitals, when you're doing surgery or something like that, you're wearing a hell of a lot more protective gear than just your mask.
Fourth, in retail, leisure and tourism and other sectors, our COVID-secure guidelines will become legal obligations. Businesses will be fined and could be closed if they breach the rules.
Yeah, see, this is the thing where if I was an MP, I would be questioning a lot about why government power is not limited. I don't think the power to enforce guidelines like this, even if we are in a pandemic, should be finable. I think sending the guidelines out was enough in the first place anyway. Most places I went to seem to be following the guidelines. I think forcing a fine upon them won't help that much.
Fifth, now is the time to tighten up the rule of six. I'm afraid that from Monday, a maximum of 15 people will be able to attend wedding ceremonies and receptions, though up to 30 can still attend a funeral as now.
Well, I know a few people getting married that will have to put it off again. Luckily for me, I'm not one of those people. However, again, I can't find any data relating to number of weddings held with over 15 people with the spread of COVID-19. Though, of course, the more people you have, the more likely you are to have infection. That just makes sense.
We will also have to extend the rule of six to all adult indoor team sports.
Well, I won't be playing football for a while then.
Finally, we have to acknowledge that the spread of the virus is now affecting our ability to reopen business conferences, exhibitions, and large sporting events.
Yeah, it's really fucking the economy.
So we will not be able to do this from the 1st of October, and I recognise the implications for our sports clubs, which are the life and soul of our communities, and my right honourable friends, the Chancellor and Culture Secretary, are working urgently on what we can do now to support them.
Let them open their stadiums, maybe have a bit of social distancing. 6 seats together, leave 2 seats, 6 seats together, something like that. Anything. Watching all this football from home, I have quite a lot of friends who are football fans. They're not enjoying it. They would really love to go to, even local county teams, they just love to go to the stadium there and have the atmosphere that they have been missing for about half a year now.
Mr. Speaker, these rules, these measures, will only work if people comply.
Based on what evidence? You've even got scientists saying that your 10 p.m. curfew will not be effective. Based on what evidence do you have to show the UK that this will only work if people comply? Because so far I'm smelling a lot of bullshit.
And there is nothing more frustrating for the vast majority who do comply, the law-abiding majority, than the sight of a few brazenly defying the rules.
Yes, I agree. The Black Lives Matter protesters and the Extinction Rebellion protesters do very much frustrate me, but it's not necessarily because they are breaking the rules. Now, the beachgoers, yes, they did piss me off because of the rules.
So these rules will be enforced by tighter penalties. We've already introduced a fine of up to £10,000 for those who fail to safe isolate, and such fines will now be applied to businesses breaking COVID rules.
To be fair, I don't think these self-isolating rules are too bad, especially if you come back from a country that genuinely does have a bad case of the COVIDs. However, they seem to be adding every country in the world to that list. So my main issue with this policy is that they seem to be adding too much to the quarantine list, rather than I think self-isolating is a bad idea.
The penalty for failing to wear a mask or breaking the rule of six will now double to £200 for a first offence. We will provide the police and local authorities with the extra funding they need, greater police presence on our streets, and the option to draw on military support where required to free up the police.
Yes, it appears that this is turning into martial law should too many people disobey daddy government. The lib right in me is tingling. I am really thinking of blasting out Keep Your Rifle by Your Side from Far Cry 5 over and over. But in the interest of time, that's pretty much Boris Johnson's main points for the lockdown. He goes on to say that they will work with local councils if there are local flare-ups in the coronavirus, and that while these are specific for England, it appears that the devolved powers in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland will be following similar rules. In fact, I believe Nicola Sturgeon was saying they want harder rules in Scotland, but hopefully it won't last as long. However, I do want to point out that it's not like every MP is backing this. Luckily, the MP for Altrincham and Sale West, Graham Brady, was on Talk Radio with Julia Hartley-Brewer to explain why he's criticising the government's position on the new COVID lockdown.
Understand why a lot of people just don't have faith in the government anymore?
Well, this is why I'm trying to do the government a favour, because it doesn't work for government to make decisions behind closed doors, to listen to some people and not to other people, and to try to cut off any discussion about it.
And Graham Brady's exactly right. There does seem to be absolutely no discussion. They seem to just be throwing darts at a board to choose the policy, and any criticism seems to be just waved away. I mean, as much as I criticise elites and quite a lot of the way science is done here, even I seem to be on the side of the scientists at the moment, though the scientists seem to want more lockdown, and I'm going in the complete opposite direction, and saying that the things harming the economy are not helping at all, and in fact we should release lockdown a bit more.
What we need to do, if people are going to remain solidly behind these measures, we need to make sure that they know that these things have been discussed, that their voices have been heard, that their representatives have been heard. And, the huge number of businesses, especially small businesses, but, my constituency, very close to Manchester Airport, huge number of people in the aviation sector as well who are going to lose their jobs and their livelihoods and might end up losing their homes as a result of policies that are being taken. It is simply not acceptable for ministers to do that by decree. It's got to be part of a national conversation, and that is what Parliament is for.
Okay, thank you.
Absolute perfect response from Graham Brady there. He is absolutely right, and there seems to be no one, apart from Graham Brady, luckily, who seems to be on my side saying that lockdown is negatively affecting the economy and that is going to have grave consequences in the future. But a lot of people seem to have this slave mentality where they want to be told exactly what to do by the government and they want government to punish people not doing it. This being the loudest faction, I guess, that seems to be what the Tories are currently listening to exclusively. So if you live in Graham Brady's constituency, I'd write him a letter saying thank you for being the voice for me, assuming you vaguely agree with me. Because yes, I am sure, especially in my area, there have been businesses closing down, there are people worried about their financial situation and their future of even being able to afford their mortgage. As helpful as the furlough was, you've got to realise that the UK public are the ones who are going to be taxed to pay it back, and it's mainly going to be the younger generations paying for it back, because we're so in debt as it is that we're probably going to be paying off the debt we already inherited for decades. Adding on all this COVID debt that Rishi Sunak seems to be happy with, it's absolutely ridiculous. It cannot run like that. We need to get a surplus as soon as possible, pay off all the debt and stop running on it. It is not how an economy can run sustainably. But anyway, that's everything I had for you today. I didn't want to go on for too long about all this. I got through the main points. I would have liked to get into how the other parties are basically saying this isn't good enough, but I mean, to be honest, it's Labour, Greens and Lib Dems. Of course they want more lockdown. And you can assume my criticisms for them, given I am very much criticising Boris Johnson for having too hard a lockdown. So, as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.